Today we are here to hear about and discuss Dr. Tamar Novick's article, Nature Herself is Anxious, Technologies Dance with the Past. Dr. Tamar Novick received her PhD from the History and Sociology of Science Department at the University of Pennsylvania in 2014. She is interested in history of technology, environmental history, and cultural studies. Her dissertation dealt with the use of science and technology as a means for establishing a mystical past in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century, and the attempts to recreate a land flowing with milk and honey. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Tel Aviv University, and will be a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science beginning next year. Her new research projects deal with the use of human waste in biomedical research and with hunting expeditions and zoological collections in Palestine and Israel. Just before we proceed with Tamar's lecture, to remind us of the time, since we're a tiny bit late, we'll have 20 minutes of lecture, 10 minutes of itainut, response, and the remainder of the time until 11:15 will be for discussion. Maybe we'll grab a few more minutes because we're starting a tiny bit late. Thank you. Tamar.
Okay, so I don't know. Am I supposed to use this? Because it doesn't. No. Okay.
You have to use it.
I have to use it. Does it work? Does it work? From what you can tell.
Secondly, my microphone is on.
Okay, I actually had. Okay, I'll start first. Most importantly, thank you very much for the Safra Center and for everyone who came to participate in this. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for me, and I'm very happy to be here. So my paper actually contained a lot of images, and so the PowerPoint is actually kind of minimal, but okay.
It works better when you turn it on.
Yeah, okay. Okay. All right. So I'm starting with a quote. Too many people are apt to consider Palestine as a natural desert or semi-desert. This view is a weed which must be rooted out of all minds. This was a declaration made by G.N. Sale, the conservative of forests of the British government in Palestine, in a lecture he gave at the Palestine Economic Society in 1942. He noted that, instead, Palestine is a natural garden and must be restored to its original condition. Sale then moved on to give a lecture he titled History of Erosion in Palestine. So here's the historical piece. Let us briefly follow the process of destruction through the ages as they can be reconstructed with fair accuracy. The land was originally covered with forest, which varied in height and composition. Multitudes of flowers were visited by the bees, which provided wild honey, one of the foods of early man. In due course, as we know from ancient literature, man evolved from the stages of hunting and honey collecting and begun to keep domestic animals. The changes in the vegetation and in the condition of the land dated from the time when the country was flowing with the milk and honey. At first, no doubt, little damage was caused by small flocks of goats and sheep, which wandered in the great forest. And it was not until man became more completely master of his environment that they enlarged his flocks to dangerous proportions. Subsequently, the invasions of less civilized races unversed in the agricultural arts led to the neglect of the terraces, which rapidly decayed, and so on and so forth. Sale was spreading this historical argument in times of expanding afforestation project that were initiated by the British government and the Jewish National Fund in Palestine. And someone wrote a book about it, actually, in the audience. It was also in times when the black herding goats, who developed an appetite for the young, newly planted pine trees, came to be seen as a threat to these projects and hence as enemies of nature. So back to the Palestine Economic Society, Sale explained how governmental methods of land management and goat control were designed to reestablish a natural order. So he said, in our conservation work, we have to ally ourselves with nature. Nature herself is anxious to avoid such phenomena, that is, of destruction, and we can count on her assistance in our effort. We must not only prevent further damage to land still capable of production, but we must take steps to repair the ravages of past neglect and to restore the fertility of the land which has been ruined by erosion. Conservation work in Palestine, therefore, has not only been about saving the land in order to ensure a better future. It's about recreating a plentiful past and reestablishing the order of nature. Such project of environmental change in Palestine all encapsulated a consistent idea and a particular historical narrative. That the narrative that the past was glorious and that the land used to literally flow with milk and honey. But that same land has since decayed. Agricultural technologies then emerged as a fitting tools for recreating this glorious past. So my research examines the ways in which different types of settlers in Palestine and Israel in the late 19th and 20th century used science and technology to recreate this consistent idea of the past. And the study centers on the design of particular agricultural technologies or agricultural production, which reflected this core belief that the land should be literally plentiful and literally flowing with milk and honey. So this is, I would say, my absolutely favorite, one of my favorite documents, and because it kind of demonstrates how literal people went, and it really says whether or not Palestine will literally become a land flowing with milk and honey is now being tested in the most practical commercial manner, and so on and so forth. It's a thick report. So I explore the dramatic biotic transformation that has occurred in the first half of the 20th century and this joint path of configuring the environment and constructing settler society. In my dissertation, the focus is how technologies and religious idea of the past, but a religious idea intertwined, and how technology and religion, or more accurately, a mystical understanding of the land, came to support each other, and I use the term technomysticism. But this time around, for this article, I tried to analyze the relation between technological projects and this particular past. So to this relationship, I call the dance. As in the case of Sale, the dance was made possible by the notion of gradual historical decline, both in historical and its more recent incarnation. Okay, so there are plenty of examples in the paper, but I'll kind of rehash the example of Methuselah because it's so cool. So one more recent case where the decline narrative is used to explain the gravity of sophisticated technologies, the actually long-lasting project that was termed in the 1930s, the return of the date palm to the land of Israel. This is the cover of one of the books that portrays a story actually of this one figure called Ben Zion Israeli. I would say that something to discuss in all the various examples is that Ben Zion Israeli was called Meshugal Hadavar, like a crazy person, and a lot of the people who are dealing with these projects are often called a little crazy. And I guess this ties to the question of significance that I'm struggling with. I mean, these are really, there's so much similarity between different cases, but sometimes, I mean, if they're that crazy, how much that, or, singular figures, how much does that matter? But I'll claim a little later that, in fact, there's a whole political infrastructure that supports these. So that's for the question of significance. Okay, so this 1930s, 40s project sought the cooperation between Jewish settlers, agronomists, science organizations, and the British and later Israeli government. It reached its heights in the 30s with the transfer, really smuggling of palm tree shoots mainly from Iraq. And the more recent case that that I'm trying to tie to this older project happens at the Arva Institute for Environmental Studies at Kibbutz Ktorah, a project combined with the cooperation of Ilan Soloway from the Arva Institute and Dr. Sarah Salone from the Hadassah Center of Medicine in Jerusalem. And in their work, they both infuse this very, very concrete ideas about the ancient past. They participate in this movement to recover the former fame of the date fruit, and they use the same narrative of decline. And not only, I mean, for a while also, the part of the project was won so much attention because it was the oldest known tree planted until in 212, an older seed, Russian seed, was sprouted, dated to 32,000 years ago. So they lost that. But so the story of the pit is that it was found in archaeological excavation at Masada, the famous Herodian fortification destroyed in 70 CE at the site of the Great Jewish Revolt against Roman powers. And they used a radiocarbon dating to detect that it was 2,000 years old, and they placed it during or right after the revolt. So that in itself is interesting. So in a 2008 article published in Science magazine, they used this the narrative of decline to explain their scientific work, and they have again this particular idea of history, of a historical narrative, and say that the Judean Dead Sea was famous for its state culture in the 1st century CE. Over the next 2 millennia, these historical cultivators were lost, and by the early 20th century, relatively few low-quality date palms survived. So Salon explained in one of the newspaper articles, she said, "We must renew our familiarity with the ancient plants that once grew in the region and investigate them scientifically to determine their characteristics." She gave a new interpretation to the project of return. So now instead of bringing them from somewhere else, she explained how current agrotech project can restore the product from within the land itself. So she said, "It feels remarkable to see the seed growing, to see it coming from the soil after 2,000 years. It's a very moving and exciting moment." Ultimately, as an article from Haaretz noted, the two researchers hope the reborn tree will provide valuable information about the Judean economy and society at the times of Jesus, but also compare the Jewish people to the date, both coming back. And they again used the phrase "len flown of milk and honey," and said that the honey there actually came from the dates. Okay. So this is the old Methuselah. I should say that they decided to call him Methuselah because they said it's the Bible's oldest man, and it wasn't a resurrection. It's not Lazarus. So it's Methuselah. It lived the whole time. There was life in it. Okay, I want to connect to some of the discussions we had yesterday about biodiversity and biosecurity. And in Yossi Leshem's wonderful presentation, he talked about, he demonstrates so beautifully this connection, but also he talked about birds knowing no borders. So I want to quote a recent article from Haaretz discussing this project, and a lot of this won a lot of press attention. So this is from a few weeks ago. So Salon, I'm quoting, "Salon has initiated the germination of ancient seed program as part of her long-term Middle Eastern medicinal plant project, works with their neighbors, Palestinians and Jordanians, to develop and conserve the medicinal plants in this area. Plants have no borders," Salon pointed out. So I thought, I mean, what I think is one of the most interesting things is like this tree, that's how it looked like in 2012, is fenced and board and monitored, and there's a camera following its movement, so it's kind of a live cam right there. So this is perhaps not biodiversity, but absolutely biosecurity. Okay, so a little bit about the nature of the dance to conclude. In all the cases described, technology became the tool for reviving an ancient glorious past, and in return the past became a guide in the construction and management of technological projects. Furthermore, technologies were also used to demonstrate that the past was indeed glorious, so it became kind of a way to make proof. I talk in the paper how I see this as a self-perpetuating circle between the past and the technology. The better the technology, the more glorious the past, the better, the more glorious the past, the technology is more justified. So in connection to the discussion of loss, what I try to highlight that in the perceptions of these scientists or agricultural experts, the past itself is what is lost, and technology became a way to revive it and hopefully to align itself with nature to reduce that anxiety. I also try to note that in all the cases, at least the ones I know for Palestine and Israel, it is often that the sophisticated technologies are used to reinforce conservative ideas. So just to one last note, so it seems that there's a gradual move to going deeper. So instead of bringing the shoots from Iraq, you can now find the whole world inside the seed. So it's instead of spatial retrieval, there's the potential is within. But at the same time, these technologies are always coupled with expansive tendencies, and they always have to do with a settlement project. It was true then and true today. So just to end with this question of the very delicate boundaries between preservation, protection, and controlling. And that's all. Thank you.
Now for our commentator. Dr. Dafna Hirsch is a faculty member in the Department of Sociology, Political Science, and Communication, where she is affiliated with the Master's Program in Cultural Studies. Her research focuses on the culture of everyday life in Mandate Palestine and Israel, and specifically on issues related to the body, food, gender, and ethnicity.
So I assume that the longer paper that I read is something read by everyone. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad for the opportunity. Okay. Tamar Novick's fascinating research project focuses on the fusion between religious sentiments and modern technological projects in the history of Palestine and Israel. She shows how, for Christian and mainly Jewish settlers, technology became a tool for reviving a glorious biblical past, while the past in its turn became a guide in the construction and management of technological projects. She describes a cyclical, self-perpetuating movement, as she defines it, where the more glorious the past, the greater the need for and justification for constructing particular technologies, and the more suited the technology for achieving this goal, the more glorious becomes the past. This narrative of revival, which is to be achieved through the use of technologies, is organized around two core metaphors, that of biblical plenty and subsequent decline. These metaphors apply not only to the natural environment, animals and plants, but also to humans, as she shows in the longer paper. In this sense, it can be seen not only as a project about the fusion of techno-science and myth, but also about the use of metaphors in science and technological development. Now, before offering some thoughts and questions on Tamar's paper, I would like to bring several examples for similar narratives of a glorious biblical past, subsequent decline, and the need to restore the glory of the past through modern science from my own research project on hygiene education in Mandate Palestine. Now, although modern hygiene seems much less likely to lend itself to biblical nostalgia, like notions of natural plenty, physicians often describe Jewish life in ancient Palestine as a period of scientific creativity, including in the area of medicine. This discourse seems even more radical than the discourse of reviving natural plenty through modern technological means, given the status of hygiene as science. Contrary to the standard narrative of the history of science's progress, physicians presented hygiene as an ancient Jewish law whose rules were still valid in the 20th century. Writes, for instance, Dr. Yaakov Zass in 1929. Even today, after millennia of progress, the laws of health maintenance legislated by our forefathers do not require any correction, and all scientists attest to their usefulness, correctness, and necessity. Not only were the ancient Hebrews in the forefront of scientific invention, they were presented as model of hygienic virtue. Here is another quote from Dr. Zass. We used to be a healthy, strong nation, shepherds, farmers, warriors. We lived a natural life with harmonically developed body and spirit, with a strong, stubborn will, a nation with a high level of hygiene, with correct understanding of physical treatment, a nation with exemplary perseverance, strong power of action, with courage both physical and moral. The diaspora dwindled our body and soul. It weakened and diminished our power of resistance. Nevertheless, in spite of this diasporic decline, the Jews were imagined as well positioned to revive the glorious past in the land of Israel. In the words of another physician, Mordechai Barchiau, also from 1929, our nation, which had perfected medicine in this land in ancient times and made it a model for other nations, and whose doctors today stand at the forefront of modern medicine in every civilized country, will know in the forthcoming years to bestow its regenerating spirit on this ancient profession, on public medicine. Now, as these quotes demonstrate, in the Zionist discourse, both the land and the people were bound together in the single narrative of ancient prosperity, diasporic decline, and revival through settlement and development, among other things through modern science. This discourse constructed a bond between the people and the land. When the two are united, prosperity occurs. When they are separated, they undergo decline. And one of the symptoms of this decline is a state of unproductiveness. The Jews in the diaspora were constructed as inherently unproductive. These narratives, which Tamar discussed and which were evident in my materials as well, rested on a central temporal duality in Zionist discourse. As Eyal Chovers has shown, in Zionist thought there are at least two temporal models. One is the linear model of progress, the other is a cyclical model. While the first model referred to the recent past and saw it as a form of existence which had to be overthrown by progress, the cyclical model turned to the distant past and regarded Zionism as a form of reenactment of this past. This duality corresponds to another duality in Zionist thought, that between the settler and the native, between Zionism as a European settler movement and a movement of return to the territory as well as to the original national existence. And as we see in Tamar's paper, return provided another powerful metaphor and was applied not just to humans but also to the natural world. Here to trees, I recently read a paper where animals brought into the Tel Aviv Zoo were discussed as returning. In an article on settler colonialism, Anna Johnston and Ellen Lawson conceptualized settler subjectivity as caught between two sources of authority and authenticity, which are both desired and disavowed. The authentic imperial culture from which the settlers are separated, here manifested in modern technoscience, and an indigenous authenticity which they desire as a sign of their own legitimacy. Obviously, the Bible was a primary source for indigenous authority and authenticity for Zionists, and Tamar mentions the settlers who roamed the country with a Bible in their hands as if it was some sort of a title deed. At the same time as Tamar's discussion of shepherding demonstrates, the Bible was not enough. One had to kind of actively perform, become a native through a kind of embodied performance. I would like to raise now several questions and points in relation to the paper. I suppose some of them are addressed in the larger study, which unfortunately I did not get a chance to read yet. First, one question I had when I was reading the paper was to what extent biblical images serve as a kind of determining factor and to what extent they function more as one justification among several. For instance, attempts to increase the fertility of cows may be explained through notions of biblical plenty, but they may also be explained through the economic and political goal of self-sufficiency. When Vulcani writes his book, The Dairy Industry as the Basis for Colonization in Palestine in 1928, milk is already considered by nutritionists to be an important component of the diet as a source of cheap animal protein, at least cheaper than meat. And cow milk is the milk which is consumed by the immigrants from Europe who do not consume sheep and goat milk and their products like the Arab and Jewish immigrants from Arab countries. So are there cases when we see biblical images actually determining the choice between two more or less equivalent alternatives of things to grow or to raise? Do they determine the course of action or do they determine courses of action which cannot be justified through any other logic? So I'm sure this is something that is discussed in more detail in the dissertation, but I'm curious to hear more about it. Second, I wonder whether the tensions between the old and the new, the past and the future, the historical and the technological, and I'm referring here to the abstract, are in fact real tensions, or rather a product of our cognitive classifications. After all, advanced technologies are often used in the service of religion. There is, for instance, an institute in Israel devoted to harnessing science and technology to solve all kinds of halakhic problems created by modern life, or think about the Sabbath elevator as just one example. Just as they are used in the service of reconstructing the past. So think about various excavation, restoration, and preservation technologies. Perhaps the basic tension is that between secularization, and I know it's a problematic concept, with its concomitant belief in progress through science and technology, and the turn to religion to justify Jewish claim to the land. At the same time, as Zionist history has taught us, people actually managed to live quite well with this contradiction. Third, I'm curious to what extent Zionists are anonymous about these images of plenty and subsequent decline. For instance, Tamar mentions a European position that the land was in fact naturally meager. Can we find a similar position among Zionists, or is it unthinkable? And do we find any arguments as to what the land was really like, or contestation of the notion that this race to plenty will actually revive biblical glory, and instead of producing a kind of ultra-modern agriculture, which is obviously very different from ancient times. Finally, although I find the connection fascinating, I'm a little skeptical about human fertility being tied to the notion of past plenty. Fertility, it should be remembered, characterized the recent past of Jewish life in the Eastern European diaspora, and although the Eastern diaspora as well, and was seen as a remnant of a pre-modern existence, and was therefore generally treated with ambivalence by European settlers, at least throughout the mandate, but later as well. So it seems to me that reproductive technologies reflect the necessity of having children, not necessarily of having plenty of them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, these wonderful comments. Just to answer briefly to these 4 questions. Okay, the question of whether the biblical notion is defining and determining, or whether it's just an ornamentation or justification for all these projects, and whether we can test them in mere economic tools, that of course comes a lot, and I think specifically about agricultural technologies or production. Most people have written in economic terms. I think one of the reasons one of the ways I'm trying to overcome this is by having various case studies that would, each of them you might say that you can explain the entire story by different tools. But if you look at all of them together, there's so much similarity in the way history is used, in the way the practices have progressed, and specifically for the case of the milk industry. So part of the agenda of Volkanov and his friends was to say that it's economically sound, but in fact it was it entailed complete environmental transformation. I mean, a lot of the agricultural production went into, satisfying the cow's demand for the milk. In many ways, as the decades progressed, a lot of people started resisting this idea that it makes sense economically. And in fact, Levi Eshkol in 1950, I think it was, he said that actually the cow is the #1 enemy of the Israeli economy. So economically sound depends on who you ask. Okay, so let's talk about the tension, whether technology and mysticism or technology and this idea of the past is actually a contradiction. In a way, it's there in any national project, I think. I mean, there's always a glorified past that is being kind of rehashed or reborn. But and you are giving this example of centers that try to mitigate this supposed tension or people that actually live fine with the tension. But I think what's interesting in this case is that the technology is not only, intention or not, it's actually constructed in order to reveal the sacred quality of the land. This is its entire purpose. It's not that it's in conflict, and I started dealing with this because of my understanding of the literature in history of science, really writing about how science and technology emerged from religious institutions and scientific scientists in a way were coming from religious institutions as well. But this is true, at least in the historiography, when you talk about any time until the early modern period. And in late modern periods, it's very almost undiscussed. It's almost not a possibility, especially when you talk about colonialism and the use of science and technologies as a new means instead of religious revelation. There are other cases scholars have shown, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, how missionaries were always agents of technology and science as well. So I'm not the only one showing that. About the discussion about the land, whether it was naturally fertile or plentiful or meager, that I can talk about this, for example, in the case of beekeeping, because it was beekeepers throughout. Beginning in the late 19th century and going all the way through. Until at least the 1960s and 70s. The question, and also in the paper I show this case of the recent excavations at Tel Rehov. It's always a question whether it was true, or was meager, or plentiful. They always argue. It's very important for them, the way it comes to play is whether it was real honey, were there bees, or was it the date palms, like Solway and Salomon argued. So they always go and debate. It's real honey or not, and the people who would support it started with mission. The French missionary family I was writing about, but later adopted by Jewish beekeepers who became professionalized, and they saw it as their duty to support this idea that there was real honey, there was a lot of it, it was everywhere, it was a plentiful land. So the debate is always there. Okay, and lastly, for the question of fertility in the ancient past, I would insist that they're very much connected. The way I try to show it is through the connection fertility experts and gynecologists had with farmers, and how they would exchange knowledge and actually materials and technologies, and how the question, you talked about the whole Eastern European questions, but a lot of the questions of infertility came or emerged with settlement, with these years of people settling here, and cows too, and sheep. So what I'm trying to actually do these past few weeks is to look at the history of endocrinology research and how much, I mean, not only the ideas and the knowledge, but very, the biological matter moved between these creatures, and it was very much intertwined. And the sense of emergency about this problem of infertility came from both directions. So, thank you.
So now we'll open the floor for questions, comments. Do you prefer to collect them together, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably aware of that, but the cow, our public enemy since the 50s, is still being subsidized both as meat cow and dairy cow in Israel. And the other thing is that there was heavy plantation of eucalypt forests in Israel because of the bee issue, because eucalypts produce a lot of pollen and nectar for bees. So it may have been a big thing in biblical times, but there was no reliance on it in later periods to work with the local plants, but there are plantations that this is their mission.
So you're saying a whole plantation project to support?
Eucalypts, one of the reasons for planting eucalypts, and one of the reasons that if conservation organizations want to remove eucalypt forests, there's eucalypt plantations, there's a movement against it, is because eucalypts support the bee industry in Israel.
So basically the non-native supporting
Yeah.
the native.
Yeah.
The native.
There were bees. I mean, there's no question about it. The honeybee is native to Israel, but it's relying now increasingly on Australian flora for its production.
Right,
So,
I could. Oh, sorry. I'll reply this later.
Are the bees the same species, or are they also introduced?
No, they're a native species. Yeah, they're native to Israel, and the honeybee is really the big producer of honey in the world. But I don't know if there are foreign strains that were brought to Israel. That I
There were.
really don't know, but
There were?
Yeah, most honey production is by Italian bees that became kind of the standardized honey making creatures across the.
Italian bees with Australian eucalyptus.
Sure.
This is how like the biblical time is revived. That's
Absolutely. I can actually say. So forgive me. I'll start. So I can. There's a lot to say about that because I mean. The whole. It's all a mixture of what they would call races. Actually, the 1880s was this period when when the story starts about the hive that changed everything. It was all part of this attempt to find the ultimate bee by North American travelers, and that's how the hive got here. But this whole idea of Australian plants helping Italian bees. I mean, this is absolutely true for the case of the cows also. I mean, the cows, being the producers of honey, are a result of interbreeding. I mean, today there are American cows that are a result of mixed breeding that originating in the Netherlands. But in the 30s and 40s, it was all about mixed breeding. It was about the local and the European, and it was the whole process of creating this technology, the high yield milking cow, was all about this exchange and creation of this the most productive creature that it has very little to do with what's local or natural in that sense. Okay.
So thank you, Tamar, and thank you, Dafna, for the response. So I think the paper, and I want to place it in the broader context of the workshop. So I think the paper is very helpful, at least in two ways. First of all, by making clear the importance of the past, not only of the future. So in the context where there's a lot of discussion of technoscience, imaginaries of the future and the development of science and technology, I think the paper, along with other papers in the workshop, point to the importance of the imaginary of the past and the development of these technologies. But then when we focus, and this is the second point, I think more nuanced, when we look at the different images and understandings of the past, I think your paper actually stands quite in contrast to the other papers some of the other papers in the workshop, because what you're talking about, your paper, the materials that you study, is not about preservation. It's about restoration of a glorious past, and perhaps here even we would want to distinguish between restoration and revival, which I don't think is exactly the same thing. And this image of revival, I think, is even stronger. And in the revival, there's this sense of intensification, which the technology actually introduces into the past by doing more than just restoring something, but really bringing to the fore its gloriousness. And I think that the different understanding of temporality here. So this is not just two different models: a linear model of progress and a cyclical model. I think that you're offering a variation on the cyclical model, which emphasizes the fact that we're not going back to the past. But I think that if we think of the examples that you have in your paper as a different grammar, a different temporality of the past, then we want to look at how it affects other components of the other stories. So, for example, the story of decline. Preservation has a story of decline, a thread, a decline, but it's a very different story of decline than the one that your paper offers. There is a decline story, but it's not this gradual decline that reaches the point of emergency in the presence. It's rather this. I want to use this carefully because it's not. It's a mythological. It's right. It has mythological dimensions to it. Right. It's a glorious past. Who knows when the decline took place? 2,000 years ago, and it's a sudden revival. So there's no graduation in this. And then also, this ties to some of the other papers. What is the difference in the images of this past, right? So when you have preservation, you know what the images need to be. You need to see the dying out of species. You need to see the figures. And in your story, the images of this,
the image of how decline looks like,
of how decline looks like, of how the past looked like, of what exactly is at stake is very different. So what we have are texts, right? These biblical texts that supposedly create these imageries of. So I think go on talking about the differences, but I think it's also helpful to emphasize some of the discussions of preservation by contrast. So it's not exactly a question, but maybe you have thoughts about where your project stands vis-a-vis preservation.
Okay. Should we collect more?
Maybe just to add to that, I thought that there was a tension in your paper that I'm not sure you presented here between shimur and shmira, between or in English between protection and control, and how those are kind of go hand in hand in this space or in this temporal spatiality, whatever, in this context. I thought that was interesting kind of to add. I'm not sure that I'm kind of feeling a little uneasy about conflating conservation to preservation and to species conservation. I mean, within conservation, restoration is actually becoming a broader, a stronger and rewilding, and various aspects of conservation are becoming, or ecosystem conservation are becoming stronger and stronger. Here you're saying conservation, but you're actually meaning very particular type of conservation.
So can you say more about what the difference is? What makes, because the words that become in my mind, maybe because I'm not exactly in the field, but now I'm a little bit confused. So there's preservation, there's conservation, then there are different kinds of conservation. Restoration.
Rewilding. There's, I mean, there are probably a lot of ecologists in here, or maybe, so I could invite other thoughts, but conservation, I mean, species conservation is one type of, that is pretty pronounced now, I would say, in the United States, but actually in decline in relationship, say, to habitat/ecosystem conservation or restoration that has kind of started coming up in the 1980s and seen as a part of conservation. I guess it doesn't, this is not just a question of terminology. I guess it's just the juxtapositions that you created seemed a little artificial to me, although they could be helpful. We can use them if we just make sure that we use the right terminology, right, which is species conservation, or more traditional types of conservation, in particular a scientific context, right, Western context. Conservation just takes on different manifestations in different places. Say in Australia, a whole species conservation is really looked down upon at this point. At least kind of with the scientists that I interviewed, this has been my experience. I don't know if I want, we can say more about that later. I guess I did want to just maybe use this just to ask one question. You said you made a really interesting statement. I was wondering about the Iraqi date project. I don't remember seeing it in the paper, or maybe
very briefly. It is.
Yeah, I was wondering about if you could expand on. You said briefly a sentence that there's a difference between the Metushelach project that was encapsulated in the seed of the potential versus bringing through geographical, the physical bringing of actually kidnapping. I think there was some story about the Iraqi date, some really.
Yep.
So, also the Orientalism there, and so all these dimensions. I was wondering if you could expand on that and bring through your thoughts about that. So sorry, this has been a little eclectic, but just threw it out.
Conventional sociological wisdom has it that Zionism is a byproduct, Zionism being a national movement, is a byproduct of modernity. Now, what you are describing is quite the opposite. That modernity is a byproduct of Zionism. because you show how the Zionist project is trapped in a bi-directional movement of turning myth into reality and reality into myth. Kind of a cyclical movement, they can't get out. But they can do it only by means of technology. Now, technology in itself is part of modernity, and it produces linear time. And linear time and progression is modernity.
Okay, I'll just say about temporality and the linearity and circulation. So the image I had in my mind was of a helix. There is something cyclical, but then there's a linear movement all at the same time. I don't know if it helps me understand anything better.
Sorry
yeah.
But I would use another image, it's a spiraling time.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the question, if it begins from the outside or from within.
Try double helix.
So triple helix. I'm not sure I know how to talk to compare this to other to conservation work. I don't know. I think they were very much intertwined in many ways. For example, I began with reading the Conservative of Forests work and how he adopted the same. He, used this same narrative. He imagined the same past. His work was all based on the same image of ancient times. I don't know if I can think of category difference there. So I'm just going to move to talk a little bit about the Iraqi case. So this Benzion Israeli guy with an assistant, they travel with the support of some the Israeli Jewish organizations to cross borders, and they smuggled shoots. On the way, part of kind of coupling coupling the return of people and trees. So they went on to visit Jewish communities. They began in the mid-30s, and it was they had several expeditions going on. And they brought back several shoots. There were all these problems. Some of them were, they were sold unofficially by local growers. The government, the Iraqi government would not allow this, but they did manage to smuggle. A lot of them didn't succeed. I mean, the shoots failed. A lot of them reached. There was all in the Kinneret area. A lot of them failed. Eventually, after 48, most of the shoots came from California. After some researchers were sent to bring them, and they have a Moroccan origin. So again, to your question of. To this question of where this whole system came from. So I was trying, on the way, they went, a big part of their journeys was to go and meet Jewish communities in Iraq and convince them to return together with the shoots. So there was a coupling, coupling of this project of return.
It really reminds me of a story in the biblical zoo about how they, kidnapped the last year from Iran, just in 1978, just before, like, with the last rugs, in the last Al flight from Iran. It's just sounds so familiar. This smuggling, this kind of illegal, there's something to that illegality here that you're.
Yeah, I can tell another story that has to do with sheep. So the way it worked with sheep, with Jewish shepherding. So there, the argument was sheep is the most, shepherding is the most ancient occupation, and the sheep actually doesn't need to be a result of breeding. It should be the local most ancient breed in order for people to be able to not only physically but in any material way connect to this ancient occupation. So there were not, or another explanation could be that the breeding attempts failed. But then after the war, after 48, shepherds were sent by the government to smuggle hundreds of sheep from all around, especially from Turkey, and there's documentation of all the countries where the sheep came from. So ancient sheep also basically Turkish.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm curious about something in your paper that's not talked about explicitly, but it's a little bit implicated, I think, also via Chaim's question, which is like a division of labor that the technology creates, or at least I'm asking if it creates a division of labor. Because like if you make a tree, like you breed a particular kind of tree that needs to be planted, then immigrants will come and there will be like a ritual and like a holiday around like planting it, and it's going to be like part of making them feel a part of the country. Or like if you breed a cow, then cow milking or like songs about, do you know what I mean, dances and songs about like all these technologies are going to be part of like the cultural education also. And I'm wondering how you think those go together. Like I know in my research on waste, it's all about
the rituals,
educating people, like chinuch, like this hagshama, like cultivating the people, and then just get them to be cultivated, and then have technologies like pick up the pieces around it, like have technology solve the problem later. Or I don't know, like if there's different, how do you see it?
So the question is what the difference is between constructing the individuals or society, settler society, and constructing a technology?
Like what importance does the technology have also as something that's
going
to be like the center of a lot of cultural work, a lot of like educational work. Or,
Should we have more?
I have questions about the title. Nature herself is anxious. Seems to be contradictory with the idea that cows are the enemy of Israel, and this kind of that cows are the enemy, and this kind of anthropomorphization of nature is always very ambivalent. Like in the world of avian influenza, there is this idea that nature is the greatest bioterrorist threat which means that viruses are coming from birds, but at the same time it means that you should not fight bioterrorists, you should know about nature and then protect nature. So this you can always read it into the side. And on the second part of your title, so I understood technomysticism, but I didn't really understand this idea of dance with the past. So is this idea of a cyclical vision of nature or technologies together? So can you, and where does it come from? Did you introduce it yourself? Or?
Okay, so yeah, the dance is just the word I thought would be appropriate to describe how this kind of swaying movement between the technology and the past and how they reinforce each other. I did not develop this any further. It's just something I use for this paper. And to answer your question about the contradiction, I think there are contradictions all along. So, for example, I talked about the importance of keeping the local sheep because it's the most ancient. But then the main milk producer of the area, the goat, the biggest population of mammals, was determined an enemy of the land and of nature and of the state and all sorts of buddies. And there's been a gradual process of separating them and exterminating the goats, or at least intended extermination. So I don't see this as a problem. Recruiting in nature as this passive thing that that technology and settlers can save worked pretty well for the general agenda. Okay.
Extermination of goats? Do you mean that they were gathered and like?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is.
By the cows.
Not by the cows, but we're very consciously. There was a conscious attempt to replace goats by cows, or sheep and cows, and so there was a process of there were.
You went to slaughterhouses, not like that.
What I read about goats has to do with began with enumeration or counting them, and then there was a whole program that was intended for the complete elimination that came to its height in the early 50s. Never completely executed, but it was a full plan. Coupling Palestinian people and Palestinian goats. I mean, it was only directed at the black goats owned by Palestinians, and it was all together as kind of ending the process of expulsion. Very explicitly said this way, not my own interpretation. But I'm trying to think about how to answer Talia's question about how this took part in education and cultivating. I have various examples of rituals that were established and where technologies played a central role, like the shearing holiday, where people were told how to dance, and the shearing machines and the Bible were together considered the center of the celebration. This is actually what I'm trying to talk in my talk tomorrow about the herd book as like a technology that we use to count cows and their production as this technology that really had this it created these rituals of the cow shed and how it organized the whole way that cows and settlers too were managed daily life and the process of production. I'm not sure this is actually completely answers questions of education, but they became kind of central, important to daily practices.
Okay, so
Okay,
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.